Hello everyone, very thrilled to be on DevDays, and today I'll be talking about story-driven development. I have a question straight away for you. Can you raise a hand who used Storybook before or heard of it? Okay, that's pretty good. I expected less from like mixed conference, but we can work with that. So I will tell a couple of words about myself. So I have about 7 years experience in front-end development, and I have about 5 years out of these 7 years of story fanboying. I started using Storybook very early, and I have 30-ish front-end projects in different roles. And I have a plan for this talk, which would be I will first explain key story-driven development concepts. Then I have a small story on how I started using stories at all. Then we will have like a pretty involved Storybook project. And then I will tell you a couple of random facts that didn't fit anywhere else, but I still wanted to talk them. So we have a couple of concepts for story-driven development. So the word itself means you have to do a lot of development and you do it in Storybook. Storybook is like a very popular development environment for front-end. And there is also a concept of stories, and story is like isolated scenario for your component. And generally, when you develop your front-end application, your flow goes like this without Storybook. You first find or create a component somewhere in the application. Then you add some changes, and you test these changes. And then you remove this boilerplate. So boilerplate is lost, and every time you implement the feature, you have to like do the same tinkering. And sometimes that's the fastest solution. So if your application is small and you know everything about it, you can go and do all these changes. That works fine. But for bigger projects, that's a problem. And you lose the story, and you might have introduced bugs, but it's hard to know. For story-driven development, flow looks a bit different. You first create like a small story for your case, and then you check all other stories for component just to be sure you didn't conflict anywhere. So with that approach, you have close to 100% chance no bug will be introduced, because if a feature is scoped to component and you checked all cases the component provides, then you can be sure it works properly. And stories are pretty cheap compared to other ways to test your components. So compared to traditional testing or UDE testing, stories obviously take more time sometimes than in-app development, but it's getting very quickly the same price. So I started my Storybook story development career with interesting thing. I had a striking pain of in-app testing, so it was like very painful for me, and I didn't know about Storybook. So the only reasonable solution you can expect in this situation is to develop your own Storybook, which I did. So I have my own library, and before I used it like for front-end developers, full stack developer, but after I moved to front-end fully, I started using it like for production projects, more involved. And for one big project, we had its startup project, and we had some issues with problems with code reviews. We introduced a lot of regressions. We were going very fast, so it was unavoidable in some sense. And estimates were insanely hard in both time, and we also struggled like to have a stable state to certain date. And we discussed it with the team, and we decided to move with stories. And we had about 1 month feature freeze. So feature was still introduced but not merged. And we reworked all key components into stories, in story-driven approach. And the result was striking. And this result is actually why I'm pushing stories on you. So that's very exciting when you introduce a technology and it like numbers increase like tenfold or something, and that's what happened here. So after introducing stories, we were able to release on demand. Number of bugs reduced from like week of bug fixing to like we can release now, it's fine. And let's start with example project. So I will guide you through a small project of creating a rating component, and we will add stories to it, and we will do some testing. Technology choice would be Vue.js and Vite, but you can use other tools. You can use Angular, React, Svelte, whatever. And you can use Webpack as well if you want. We will start with creating a Vite project with Vue template. After that, we will get dependencies, and we will run development server. And yes, there will be no live coding. It's too dangerous for me. And we got new project running, but there is no storybook yet. We have to add it. So let's add a storybook. For that, we have to use storybook init command, and it's a very powerful command because it analyzes your environment, your project, and it adds what is needed for storybook to work. So if you use Vue, it adds like plugins for Vue. If you use React, it's adding plugins for React and such. So essentially, you run one command, and things might work for you, and they certainly do for me. So after we run yarn storybook command, which will run development server for storybook, we can see our storybook is visible. In storybook, you have two parts. Left is navigation, that's where your stories sit, and second is like story preview, story view. And we have to create component because project is empty. For that, we will write on a hype train and ask ChatGPT to create us a rating component. So we have a prompt with 3 props: max rating value, icon, and model value to pass value to rating component. And AI did its best and generated us a component. This seems to be all right from the first glance. Maybe it's not, we don't know yet, but let's roll with it. And we have to add stories now because we have component already. It's conventional to keep stories in stories file, so we'll add one, and inside that file you have a requirement to have a meta or default export, and in that export you have also to define a component, and Storybook does a lot of magic with component declaration, so it has to know this information. After that, we also have to define at least one story, because if it wouldn't work if we don't. So we will create a default story. Default story is a bit of a tricky concept because normally you would think it's best to create story that is tailored to specific case, but for default story it's something like a minimal standalone case, and it would sit on top of your other stories and would represent like an essence of component. So for rating, I believe this essence would be just value, and you can change this value. So it works. We can change rating, but there is a bug here. Maybe you can notice it. Okay, so bug is that index was off by 1 value. So we can fix it quickly, and we have no bugs. We have functioning component. Now we have a couple of improvements we have to implement as well. It's modifiable max, modifiable icon, and second leak should deselect value for our rating. Start with max. So we will create a story. We are going to test it, and it works fine from the first try. Good luck. So, and I want to deep dive a bit on this case. So props interactions are a bit tricky in component. So you don't really know sometimes if one prop interacts with another, and you have a couple of solutions to handle these cases. So you can go to the paranoia side too much, and it would be like you will have a story for all your prop interactions. That's a massive amount of work, not recommended. Then you can go to another side and be like, okay, it's fine. Let's create just one big story, and then developers can test them by themselves. So similar to a playground. And that's not ideal. And ideal state in my perspective is if a prop doesn't have interactions from developer's perspective, they will just use it in their story. And if it's 2 props or more, we create a special story that would be interaction story that narrows down our view to these 2 props. And then we use playground, which is like a story with all props in it you can change as an additional means for testing. That's it. Let's move to another functionality. So we have icon prop, and we set it, and it doesn't seem to work because we should see green square and we don't. So what's going on? All right, so in this case it seems the story is 2 prop at least. So we have to select to add a value to the rating. We added a value, still doesn't seem all right. So let's add another prop. So it's a 3 prop in fact. And now it works fine. Now the last thing is the selecting value functionality. So one way to do this testing is you have default story, and you can say, okay, so like you have default story, just click on it. That's it. You don't need a story for that. I disagree. I think we need a story for each functionality. Developers shouldn't test it manually. So for that, Storybook has interactions, and there you can kind of create a small E2E test and define what you want for how you want a component to behave. In our case, we want to find 3rd item, click on it, and then click on it again. And in after first click, it should be true. After second, it should be false. We also have to add some boilerplate for these to be working properly to the component. And we do this interaction, and it fails. That's great. That's what we expect. We have to introduce a fix. In our case, AI did a bad job. It seems I can still keep mine for now. We have a small fix, and it works now. Cool thing about this interaction, these small E2E tests, is that you actually can automate it very quickly. So it's all integrated in Storybook already. So we run yarn test Storybook command, and Storybook runs automation runs all stories. It also does a smoke testing for stories that doesn't include automation. Very useful. But we have a couple of issues right now with our stories. So there is too much duplication, too much code. Maybe we can do something about it. And indeed we do. We have args concept in Storybook. So you can define your props in object way, and then it's getting transferred to a component. So it's much less code. Another thing that might sound tricky for you is that to test all stories, we have to do a lot of navigation. So you have 4 stories right now, but in actual application, it could be like maybe 500 stories. And you can imagine, you know, going through these 500 stories and testing all of them would be a bit of a nightmare. Doing this after like every change is also not possible. So how great would it be if Storybook has some concept to simplify this? And it does. The feature is called autodocs, and it's 1 line to implement. What it does, it groups all your stories and also adds playground to the top. So we can observe all our stories in 1 page. We will add 1 more thing just to showcase how flexible this documentation is. We can add a description to story, and you can see, like for stories, you will see a description. Sometimes very useful. 1 more thing we can do for stories is to add controls. We will define a type of property, and we will add some description. So now we have control in our story. So what that means is that you can change every prop, and you will see changes in component directly. So you can still do it like in DEVDAYS, but it's much more comfortable doing this way. And you also have reactivity for your URL. So you can see we have like max icon and such in URL, and it's very useful to send it to some other developer so that they can just put it into a browser, and have a very quick reproduction. You can also send this to a client if they have like maybe some unique device or something. Again, they can just run it and see if it works. Also, Autodocs, they cached our update, so we defined props, and now in docs you can see all these descriptions. Controls, I believe, are not the universal tool, so I would recommend to use them as playgrounds and as a tool for communication, but not as a replacement for stories. Again, like it's ideal if developer doesn't have to do manual work to test stuff. And let's move to visual testing. Let's add some flair. Why do you need visual testing? So you might have some human factor issues, like you maybe released at the Friday evening that didn't go as well as you planned, or you maybe do not want to post to Slack and say, hey guys, check my project, maybe you can find some bugs, and no one will test. Or you have to pick a project to test manually, so it's not possible even. So we need some automation in that. I will use Percy for this project, but you can use some other tools. So Percy does what we need to do, shows screenshots for every Storybook page. It allows us to review them, it's configurable, but it's not focused on Storybook. There are like more tailored tools like Chromatic, so you might want that maybe. And installing Percy is straightforward. We add a couple of dependencies, we export tokens so that Percy knows which project should it get screenshots into. And last line is a bit interesting. So we run Storybook build before we send our screenshots to our project to Percy. So Storybook build is needed because for library development, it's crucial to test it after it's built already, because in staging, or rather in your local version, it could have different results. So it could be working for you, but not working for someone else. With build, that is excluded. And in Percy View, we can already see our first build. And if we go inside, we see some stories with rating component. And let's try to see if it works. So we will update model value from 2 to 3. And indeed it works. So we can observe a change. So running visual tests for small projects could be done manually. I think most of the value comes from running it when you have a release. So you just run it before release. But it's ideal, obviously, to have it automated, done in TCI, and also like maybe use a proof flow. Like it's a bit of a heavy case. So that's it with our small project. Overall, what we did, we have a rating component, fully developed in story-driven way. All functionality is covered. We have interactions to test complex behavior. We have docs for this component, and we have controls, and we also added some visual testing. So now we went to the random part, so it would be a bit messy probably. Which area story-driven development can improve for you? One area is connecting with design team. So if you don't use Storybook, if you don't have like a coherent documentation for your components, it's sometimes what would happen is that design implementation could be different from front-end implementation. So, or maybe for design it would be even different components, but for front-end it would be one component. So it's even hard to know if you are talking about the same thing when you're communicating with the designer. You can also have variation of same component across different designs. And Storybook does a great job shortening the path between you and developer, between designer and developer. And you can actually integrate Figma into your Storybook, so that designer you can navigate quickly. And what we also did in Storybook, we also added Storybook links to Figma, so you have like cross-linking between the two. One more thing that Storybook could help you with is informing stakeholders. when you're working on a component on deep level, it might be hard to like explain what you did exactly if it's not an application yet. Storybook solves that case. You can go check like how future work is going, and that makes stakeholders very happy. So when you're working on Storybook, you might want to prioritize certain components to another components. So especially that's the case if you didn't use Storybook before and you're only like integrating it into a project. So I think the first thing you should bother with storybooking is complex modular components, such like select, maybe data tables if you have them, form components, maybe something specific to a business that is like logic packed. And the reason is that it's very easy to get regression. These components are hard to understand for developer, hard to support. And they're also often used in a lot of places across the application. So if something bad happens, it might happen like across the whole app, which is not ideal. Second, I would use Storybook for simple modular component and CSS utilities. For these, the reason they're second place is that it's sometimes hard to break if it's like display component, not much logic in there, and but it's good for documentation still. So you can like share, this is a card, like this is maybe a like header of some sort, and we have these styles, so still pretty useful. Third, I would use Storybook for page level components and standalone widgets. So these are very hard to mock because they are often connected to store, maybe even to multiple stores. So it's a lot of work to make stories work. And they are also testable in application. So often you can just go to the page and be like, all right, so I see the exact case I need to reproduce. That's it. And we have another way of prioritizing, which is by business value. So obviously you should target with stories first the part of the application that is very important for business. Maybe it's undergoing active development right now, so that's a good thing for focus. And interesting trick is to use recent Git changes to see which components were like most changed. And that's it for my talk. And I have a bit of a tiered image with different value. So I think 80% of the value comes from free tier of stories, which would be like you have not a lot of stories only for high value components. Then you will use manual testing. You will use manual visual testing because visual testing sounds scary but is very easy to integrate into a project. You will use it primarily to communicate between developers, maybe stakeholders, but not designers yet. And you will use autodocs. Again, these are pretty much free. If you move a bit higher in investment costs, you get a pro tier. It should be like 90% of value. And you will also add stories for simple components and CSS in there. You will use automated testing, pipelined, and you will do the same for visual testing. You will document stories more, so you can do more with Storybook docs. And you can also integrate design and use Storybook to communicate with your design team. But that's like effort, continuous, which you have also like to force sometimes. And if you go in like head and toes to Storybook, that's your enterprise grade. You have a lot of value, but it takes a lot of effort as well. You will use Storybook for all your stories, and you will probably use your Storybook for documentation on components instead of creating like a separate application. And that's it with my talk.